The cabin was silent except for the crackle of wood burning in the fireplace. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 32 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. It was January 17, 1883, in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana Territory. The kind of night when conventional cabins became roaring furnaces of wasted heat, chimneys glowing red, massive fires consuming cord after cord of precious firewood just to keep the interior barely habitable. In most mountain cabins that night, men fed their fireplaces constantly, logs as thick as a man's thigh, stacked 3 and 4 deep, burning hot enough to make the stones glow. The heat rose straight up the chimney, wasted to the outside air. The cabin stayed cold despite the massive fires. 30 degrees inside, if you were lucky, 20 degrees in the corners, ice forming on the walls despite flames hot enough to hurt your face if you stood too close. But in one cabin, 7 miles up a narrow valley where few men ventured, a Russian immigrant named Dimitri Volkov sat comfortably in his shirt sleeves, reading by lamplight. His fire was tiny, 6 sticks of wood, each no thicker than a broom handle, burning in a shallow firebox. The flames were low and controlled, nothing like the roaring blazes in other cabins. Yet the interior temperature was 64 degrees Fahrenheit, not near the fireplace. Throughout the entire cabin, every corner, every wall, uniformly warm. More remarkably, Dimitri had lit this small fire at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was now 10 o'clock at night, 6 hours ago. The fire had burned for perhaps 20 minutes before dying down to embers. Those embers had gone cold an hour ago. The firebox was now empty and cold to the touch, yet the cabin remained at 64 degrees and would stay that way until morning. His neighbors, the few who knew about his cabin, called the fireplace design illegal. They said it violated every rule of safe chimney construction. The smoke didn't go straight up. The flue didn't draw properly. The whole system should have filled the cabin with deadly smoke and carbon monoxide. Any fire marshal or chimney expert would have condemned it immediately. Building inspectors, if they'd existed in the Montana Territory mountains, would have forced him to tear it out. Instead, the illegal fireplace heated Dimitri's entire cabin with a fire so small it would have been considered inadequate kindling in a normal fireplace. A fire that burned for 20 minutes and provided warmth for 24 hours. A heating system so efficient it seemed to violate thermodynamics itself, and a design so contrary to accepted practice that sharing it publicly could have resulted in prosecution for encouraging dangerous construction. This is the story of how one man's childhood memory of Russian peç masonry heaters, combined with systematic experimentation, created the most efficient heating system ever built on the American frontier. How routing smoke through mass instead of venting, it directly turned waste heat into stored energy. And how what every expert would call illegal became the only thing that actually worked in the extreme cold of the high mountains. Dimitri Volkov was born in 1850 in a village outside Novgorod, Russia. His family, like most Russian peasant families, lived through brutal winters in a small log house heated by a traditional pech, pronounced pech. This was not a simple fireplace. It was a massive masonry structure that dominated the center of the house. Built from brick and clay, the pech was typically 10 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 7 feet tall. It weighed several tons. The pech's design was unlike anything Americans built. A small firebox at the base, barely large enough for an armful of kindling. From the firebox, the smoke didn't go straight up and out. Instead, it was routed through a complex maze of internal passages within the masonry mass. The smoke traveled horizontally, then down, then up, then horizontally again, winding through channels that forced it to give up every bit of heat to the surrounding brick before finally exiting through a chimney. A small fire, burned hot and fast in the morning, would heat the entire pech mass. That mass, weighing 3 or 4 tons, would store the heat and radiate it slowly throughout the day and night. The house stayed warm for 24 hours from a fire that burned for 30 minutes. This was how Russian peasants survived winters that made Montana seem mild. Young Dimitri helped his father maintain their pech, learning how to build the morning fire, how to judge when enough wood had burned, how to close the dampers to trap heat in the mass. He understood intuitively what engineers would later calculate. Thermal mass could store enormous amounts of energy. Heat that would have escaped up a conventional chimney could instead be captured in brick and released slowly over time. In 1871, at age 21, Dimitri left Russia to escape mandatory military service. He made his way to America, arriving in New York with no money, no English, and only the skills of a Russian peasant farmer. He worked various jobs, moving west, learning English slowly, saving what little money he could. By 1879, he'd reached Montana Territory. The mountains reminded him of Russia, though taller and more dramatic. He filed a mining claim in the Bitterroots, hoping to find gold or silver. He found neither. But he stayed, supporting himself through trapping and hunting, living alone in the high country. His first winter in Montana nearly killed him. He'd built a standard American-style cabin with a conventional stone fireplace. The fireplace, by frontier standards, was well constructed. Good draw, solid chimney. It should have been adequate. Instead, it was a disaster. The fire needed constant feeding. The heat went straight up the chimney. The cabin stayed miserably cold. Dimitri burned more firewood in 3 months than he'd thought possible. He was constantly exhausted from cutting and hauling wood, and he was still cold. He survived that winter, but knew he couldn't continue that way. The labor of feeding a conventional fireplace was unsustainable. There had to be a better method. He remembered the pech from his childhood, a small fire providing all-day warmth, mass storing heat, efficiency that made Western fireplaces look primitive. In the spring of 1880, Dimitri began planning a Russian-style heater for his cabin. He couldn't build a traditional pech. He lacked the brick. He lacked the expertise for the complex internal passages. But he understood the principle: force smoke to give up its heat to mass before letting it escape. Capture the waste, store the energy, release it slowly. He designed a system using materials available in Montana, river stones instead of brick, a firebox made from flat rocks, internal passages created by carefully stacking and spacing stones, a chimney that didn't go straight up but meandered through a mass of stone, extracting heat at every turn. The design he sketched out would have horrified any chimney sweep or fire safety expert. The flue path was indirect, winding, with multiple direction changes. The smoke had to travel horizontally, then down below the level of the firebox, then up through channels in a massive stone structure, then horizontally again before finally exiting. Conventional wisdom said this would never draw properly. The smoke would back up. The cabin would fill with deadly fumes. The system was dangerous and should never be built. Dimitri built it anyway. He started in June of 1880, tearing out his old fireplace and beginning construction of what he called his petka, a small pitch. The work was slow and meticulous. Each stone had to be carefully selected and placed. The internal passages had to be sized correctly. Too large in heat would escape too quickly. Too small and smoke wouldn't flow properly. The base was a platform of heavy stones, raised slightly off the cabin floor. On this platform, Dimitri built the firebox. Small, only 18 inches wide, 20 inches deep, and 12 inches tall, barely large enough for a few sticks of wood. Around and above the firebox, he built a massive structure of river stones, carefully mortared with clay. Inside this stone mass, Dimitri created channels. The first channel led from the top of the firebox horizontally to the back of the structure. There, the smoke was forced down through a vertical passage, dropping below the level of the firebox. This was the part that would make any chimney expert declare the design insane. Smoke shouldn't go down. Hot gases rise. Forcing them down would create backdraft and fill the cabin with smoke, But Dimitri understood something about hot smoke. It doesn't want to rise. It wants to expand and move along any available path. If the only path is down, and if there's sufficient draw from the final chimney, the smoke will go down. The key was making the entire path through the mass shorter and less restricted than the alternative of backing up into the cabin. From the bottom passage, the smoke was routed up through vertical channels within the stone mass. These channels weren't straight. They zigzagged, forcing the smoke to contact maximum stone surface. Each bend, each surface contact transferred heat from the hot smoke to the cool stone. By the time the smoke reached the top of the structure, it had traveled perhaps 30 feet through stone passages. It had given up most of its heat. It was no longer hot, just warm. Still warm enough to create draft, but cool enough that most of the fire's energy was now stored in the stone mass. At the top, the smoke finally entered a more conventional chimney that rose through the roof. But even this chimney was unusual. It was built as part of the stone mass, not separate. The final few feet of vertical rise were inside a stone column that absorbed the last bit of heat. The completed structure was massive, 7 feet long, 4 feet deep, and 6 feet tall. It weighed approximately 3 tons of carefully placed river stone and clay mortar. It dominated Dimitri's small cabin, taking up significant floor space. The system looked bizarre. It looked dangerous. It looked like something that couldn't possibly work. His nearest neighbor, a trapper named Samuel Bridger, who lived 4 miles down the valley, visited in late September to see what Dimitri had built. Bridger had 40 years of frontier experience. He knew fireplaces. He knew chimneys. He took one look at Dimitri's petka and shook his head. "That's the most illegal chimney I've ever seen," Bridger said. "Smoke going down, flue path wandering all over. You're going to smoke yourself out of your own cabin, or worse, get yourself killed with carbon monoxide." "In Russia, we build this way for hundreds of years," Dimitri replied in his heavily accented English. "Works very good." "This isn't Russia. This is Montana. We have proper building methods here. Straight chimneys? Good draft. You can't force smoke to go sideways and down. It won't work." "We will see when winter comes." Bridger examined the structure more closely. The passages inside were barely visible, just small openings where smoke would presumably flow. The whole thing looked like a pile of rocks with a firebox carved into it. There was no way this would heat a cabin properly, and there was every chance it would fill the cabin with deadly smoke. "Dimitri, I'm telling you, as a friend, tear this out and build a proper fireplace before you kill yourself. This design violates every safety rule that exists. Rules made by people who burn too much wood. This burns small fire, stores heat in stone, releases slow, very efficient. Wags. Efficient doesn't matter if you're dead from smoke inhalation. Promise me you'll at least test it on a warm day first before you're dependent on it. So, if it doesn't work, you're not trapped in a cold cabin full of smoke." Dimitri agreed to test it carefully. Bridger left, convinced that Dimitri would either rebuild properly or die trying to heat with an illegal fireplace design. The first test came in early October. Dimitri prepared carefully. He opened all the windows, providing ventilation in case the cabin filled with smoke. He built the smallest possible fire in the firebox, just a handful of kindling and 2 small sticks of wood. He lit it and stepped back, watching carefully for any signs of smoke backing into the cabin. The kindling caught. Smoke rose from the small flames. For a moment it seemed to hesitate, unsure which way to go. Then, as the fire grew slightly hotter, the smoke began flowing, not up into the cabin, into the horizontal passage at the back of the firebox. The draw was working. The smoke was going where Dimitri had designed it to go. He watched for 10 minutes. The fire burned cleanly. No smoke entered the cabin. The smoke was being drawn through the internal passages. He could smell nothing except clean wood smoke from the fire itself, the pleasant smell of burning pine. No acrid smoke filling the room, no carbon monoxide symptoms. The illegal system was working. The fire burned out after about 15 minutes. Dimitri closed the damper, trapping the heat in the stone mass. Then he waited. The real test was whether the stored heat would radiate into the cabin. An hour passed. The stones were noticeably warm to the touch. The cabin temperature had risen from 50 degrees to 55 degrees. Small change, but measurable. The principle was working. By evening, the stone mass was radiating steady warmth. The cabin held at 58 degrees, warmer than it had been before the fire, and the stones were still warm. The next morning, 12 hours after the fire had gone out, the cabin was still 56 degrees. The stone mass had held heat overnight and released it slowly. The illegal heater worked exactly as Dimitri had designed it to work. But that was a test fire in moderate weather. The real proof would come in deep winter. In November, as temperatures dropped into the 20s, Dimitri began using the petka as his primary heat source. Each afternoon, around 4 o'clock, he would build a small fire, 6 to 8 sticks of wood, each no more than 1.5 inches in diameter. He'd burn them hot and fast, getting maximum heat in minimum time. The fire would burn intensely for 20 to 30 minutes, then die down. As the fire burned, the smoke traveled through the maze of passages, heating the 3 tons of stone. The mass absorbed the energy greedily. By the time the smoke reached the chimney exit, it was barely warm. Most of the heat from the fire had transferred to the stone. Once the fire burned out, Dimitri would close the damper completely, trapping the heat in the mass. The stone would radiate that heat for the next 24 hours. The cabin temperature would stay between 55 and 65 degrees depending on outside conditions. 1 small fire per day, 20 minutes of burning, 24 hours of warmth. The efficiency was remarkable. Dimitri's firewood consumption was perhaps 1/10 of what his conventional fireplace had required. Samuel Bridger visited again in December. The temperature outside was 15 degrees. He expected to find Dimitri bundled near a fire, burning wood constantly like everyone else. Instead, he found Dimitri comfortable, the firebox cold and empty. "Where's your fire?" Bridger asked. "Burned yesterday at 4 o'clock. Finished by 4:30. Now is next day. Past noon. No fire needed yet." Or Bridger felt the air temperature. It was warm, actually comfortable. He touched the stone mass. It was still noticeably warm, radiating heat steadily. The cabin felt better than his own cabin did with a fire currently burning. "This actually works," Bridger said, amazed. "Your illegal chimney actually heats the cabin." Not illegal in Russia. Just illegal in minds of people who think chimney must be straight. But how? The smoke going down, the winding passages. Every fire expert would say this is dangerous and impossible. Dimitri explained the principle as best he could in his imperfect English. Hot smoke had energy. Conventional chimneys wasted that energy by venting it directly outside. His design captured the energy by forcing smoke to contact stone mass. The stone absorbed the heat. The smoke, cooled, still had enough heat to create draft and exit safely. But the majority of the fire's energy stayed in the cabin as stored heat in the mass. So you're not heating the air directly, you're heating the rock, and the rock heats the air. Yes, rock is battery for heat. Charge battery with fire. Battery gives heat back slowly. Air heats and cools quick. Rock heats and cools slow. Slow is good. Means stable temperature. Bridger sat in the warm cabin for an hour, experiencing the comfort that a 20-minute fire from the previous day was still providing. When he left, he was already planning to build his own version of the illegal heater. The conventional rules about chimneys were clearly wrong when the goal was efficiency rather than just venting smoke quickly. Word spread slowly through the scattered population of mountain men and trappers. Most were skeptical. A fireplace where smoke went down? Where the fire burned for 20 minutes once a day? Where rules about straight chimneys were violated? It sounded impossible. Dangerous, illegal. Several trappers made the trek to Dimitri's cabin just to see if the stories were true. They found exactly what Bridger had described. A small fire, burned once daily, a massive stone structure that radiated heat constantly, a cabin that stayed warm without the constant fire tending that consumed most of every winter day for conventional cabin owners. The illegal heater worked. It worked better than anything legal. The real validation came during the brutal cold of January 1883. When temperatures dropped to 32 below and stayed there for a week, conventional cabins became desperate situations. Fires burning continuously, massive wood consumption, interior temperatures still dangerously cold. Several trappers abandoned their cabins and moved to lower elevations where the cold was less severe. Dimitri's cabin maintained 60 to 65 degrees throughout the cold snap. His single daily fire, tiny by any standard, provided consistent comfort. The 3-ton stone mass stored enough energy that even when outside temperatures were extreme, the interior remained stable. The thermal battery he'd built was large enough that daily recharging kept it warm enough to heat the cabin regardless of outside conditions. If you're fascinated by these revolutionary heating techniques that challenged every accepted rule but delivered superior results, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We uncover the forgotten innovations of frontier settlers who understood thermodynamics and heat transfer at levels that shame modern assumptions about proper construction. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss these incredible stories of practical physics applied to survival. By spring of 1884, 3 trappers had built their own versions of Dimitri's masonry heater. The designs varied. One trapper built a smaller version, only 4 feet long instead of 7, with simplified internal passages. It worked, but required 2 fires per day instead of 1. Another trapper built a larger version, 9 feet long, with more complex internal channels. It worked so well he could skip a day between fires if weather was moderate. The third trapper, a man named Hans Müller, built his heater with a horizontal bench section where the stone mass extended along one wall of his cabin. This bench was warm enough to sit on comfortably. It became his favorite spot, a heated seat that stayed warm all day from the morning fire. Müller's design innovation spread, and future heaters often included sitting benches as part of the thermal mass. None of these designs would have passed any official inspection. All violated the cardinal rule of chimney construction. Smoke must vent directly upward through a straight flue. All forced smoke through indirect paths, through passages that went down before going up, through mazes that conventional wisdom said would cause backdraft. Yet all worked. All provided superior heating with minimal fuel consumption. The illegal approach was demonstrably better than the legal method. The reason for this efficiency advantage was physics that most frontier builders didn't understand. A conventional fireplace, with its straight chimney, operates on the principle of draft. Hot air rises. A tall chimney creates strong draft. The fire burns hot. The smoke vents quickly. Everyone assumes this is good. But it's not good for heating. It's good for venting smoke. Those are different goals. In a conventional fireplace, most of the fire's energy goes up the chimney. Perhaps 80% of the heat is wasted to the outside air. Only 20% actually warms the cabin, and that only while the fire is burning. Once the fire goes out, the heating stops immediately. To maintain warmth, you must maintain the fire constantly. This requires enormous fuel consumption and constant labor. Dimitri's masonry heater captured perhaps 70% of the fire's energy in the stone mass. Only 30% escaped up the chimney, enough to maintain draft but not enough to represent serious waste. The captured energy, stored in 3 tons of stone, was released slowly over 24 hours. The heating continued long after the fire stopped. The labor of fire tending was reduced from constant to once daily. The fuel consumption dropped by 90%. The 3-ton stone mass had enormous heat capacity. Stone holds approximately 0.2 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit. 3 tons, 6,000 pounds, times 0.2 equals 1,200 BTU per degree. If the fire heated the mass by 100 degrees, that's 120,000 BTUs stored. Releasing that energy over 24 hours provided 5,000 BTUs per hour. A cabin in cold weather might need 3,000 BTUs per hour to maintain comfortable temperature. The stored energy was more than sufficient. The winding passage design was critical. Smoke entering the passages at perhaps 800 degrees needed to cool to perhaps 200 degrees before exiting. That 600-degree temperature drop through contact with stone surfaces over 30 feet of passage length transferred enormous energy from smoke to mass. The length and surface area of the passages determined how much energy was captured. Samuel Bridger, convinced by what he'd seen, built his own masonry heater in the summer of 1884. His design was based on Dimitri's, but adapted to his cabin size and his available stones. The passages were slightly different, the proportions varied, but the principle remained. Force smoke through mass before venting it. Bridger's heater worked on the first try. A small test fire demonstrated proper draw and no smoke backup. By winter of 1884 to 1885, Bridger was heating his cabin with the same minimal fuel consumption that Dimitri enjoyed. Bridger, who'd called the design illegal and dangerous, became its strongest advocate. He described the heater to every trapper and mountain man he encountered, explaining how it worked and why it was superior to conventional fireplaces. The spread of masonry heater designs through the Montana mountain communities was slow but steady. These were not easy structures to build. They required skill in stoneworking, understanding of smoke flow, and willingness to invest significant time in construction. A conventional fireplace could be built in a week. A masonry heater took a month or more, but those who built them never regretted the investment. By 1890, perhaps 20 cabins in the Bitterroot region had masonry heaters. The designs showed considerable variation. Some were large, some small. Some had sitting benches, others had sleeping platforms built into the warm mass. One innovative builder created a baking oven as part of the stone structure, using retained heat for cooking hours after the fire went out. The basic principle, capturing heat in mass and releasing it slowly, remained constant across all variations. The technical knowledge spread through direct demonstration and word-of-mouth instruction. Dimitri helped several builders design their heaters, drawing sketches, explaining the critical dimensions, warning about common mistakes. He never charged for this assistance. He viewed it as sharing knowledge that should be freely available. The Russian tradition of community support extended to teaching anyone who asked. One common mistake was making the passages too small. Restricted passages created excessive draft resistance, making it difficult to get smoke to flow properly. Another mistake was inadequate mass. A heater with only 1 ton of stone wouldn't store enough energy for 24-hour heat release. A third mistake was poor sealing. Any air leaks in the passage system would reduce efficiency and potentially allow smoke into the cabin. The most critical element was the downdraft channel, the passage where smoke was forced to go down before coming back up. This violated every instinct about how smoke should move. Builders were tempted to eliminate this feature, thinking it was unnecessary or dangerous, but Dimitri insisted it was essential. The downdraft channel created the long, winding path that maximized heat transfer. Without it, the system was just an inefficient fireplace with extra mass attached. The illegal nature of these heaters was not just a figure of speech. If Montana had had building codes and fire inspectors in the 1880s, these heaters would have been condemned. They violated fundamental principles that fire safety experts believed were absolute requirements for safe chimney operation. Smoke must vent directly upward. Violated. The masonry heaters routed smoke horizontally and downward before allowing it to rise. Chimneys must provide strong draft. Violated. The winding passages created significant flow resistance, reducing draft to the minimum needed for operation. Fireplaces should provide immediate heat. Violated. The masonry heaters provided delayed heat, reaching peak output hours after the fire went out. Chimneys should be separate from living spaces. Violated. The massive stone structures occupied significant floor space and were integrated into the cabin layout. Yet these violations of accepted rules produced superior results. The heaters were safer, not more dangerous. They never caused chimney fires because creosote buildup was minimal. The hot, fast fires consumed combustion byproducts completely. The extended heat release meant no risk of overheating. The gradual temperature rise and fall created stable, comfortable conditions. The reduced fire tending meant less risk of accidents from constant fire management. A professor from the Montana School of Mines, Dr. William Thornton, visited Dimitri's cabin in 1892 to study the heater design. Thornton was researching efficient heating methods for mine buildings and had heard about the unusual masonry heaters in the Bitterroots. He spent 3 days taking measurements, documenting temperatures, and observing the system's operation. Thornton's report, published in the Journal of Mining Engineering in 1893, provided the first technical analysis of masonry heater performance. His calculations confirmed the dramatic efficiency advantage. He measured thermal efficiency, the percentage of fuel energy that actually heated the building, at approximately 72% for Dimitri's heater. A conventional fireplace, measured for comparison, achieved only 18% thermal efficiency. The report also addressed the safety concerns. Thornton measured carbon monoxide levels in the cabin during and after firing. He found no dangerous accumulation, the combustion was complete, the draft sufficient, and the system safe. He concluded that, while the design violates conventional chimney practice, it does so in ways that improve, rather than compromise, safety. The short, intense fires produce clean combustion. The thermal mass prevents overheating. The system represents an advancement in heating technology disguised as a violation of established rules. Thornton's published analysis gave academic credibility to what mountain men had discovered through practical experimentation. The illegal heaters weren't just effective, they were demonstrably superior to legal alternatives. The rules they violated were arbitrary conventions rather than physical requirements. The broader impact of masonry heater technology extended beyond individual comfort and fuel savings. The dramatic reduction in firewood consumption had environmental benefits. Areas around cabins with masonry heaters showed less deforestation. Trees could be harvested sustainably rather than clear-cut for fuel. The lighter demand on forest resources meant better long-term viability of mountain communities. The labor savings were equally significant. A mountain man using a conventional fireplace might spend 4 to 6 hours daily on firewood tasks, cutting, splitting, hauling, and tending the fire. A mountain man with a masonry heater spent perhaps 30 minutes daily. The difference was 5 hours per day, available for other activities. Over a winter, this accumulated to hundreds of hours, time that could be used productively or simply enjoyed as rest. The economic implications were substantial. Firewood, even when cut personally rather than purchased, had value. The time invested in obtaining it represented opportunity cost. Reducing firewood needs by 90% freed up time that could be used for trapping, hunting, or other income-producing activities. For subsistence mountain men, this efficiency improvement could mean the difference between barely surviving and actually prospering. Before we continue with the long-term legacy of this heating innovation, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. These stories of practical problem-solving that violated conventional wisdom but delivered superior results contain lessons that remain relevant today. Whether you're interested in efficient heating, frontier innovation, or understanding how rules can be wrong while results are right, these stories provide valuable insights. Don't miss out. Dimitri Volkov continued living in his cabin with its illegal heater until 1908. By then, he was 58 years old and ready to leave the harsh mountain life. He moved to Missoula, Montana, where he lived with a niece's family and worked as a stonemason. His skill in building masonry structures, learned through building heaters, provided him with steady work in his final years. The cabin and its heater remained standing until 1932, when a forest fire swept through the valley. The wooden portions of the cabin burned completely, but the stone heater survived. When a hiking party discovered the ruins in 1935, the 3-ton masonry structure stood intact, a monument to construction that outlasted the building around it. The complex internal passages, carved from river stone and clay mortar, were still visible. The fire had actually baked the clay, making it harder. The structure that was built to channel fire had been tested by fire and survived. In the late 20th century, masonry heater technology experienced a revival. Energy crises in the 1970s prompted renewed interest in efficient heating. Builders rediscovered that masonry mass heaters, similar to what Dimitri had built, were the most efficient wood-burning heating method available. Modern designs, often called Russian fireplaces or Finnish contraflow heaters, use the same principles. Burn small fires hot and fast, route smoke through masonry mass, store heat, and release slowly. Contemporary masonry heater manufacturers produce units with thermal efficiencies exceeding 80%. These modern heaters use refractory brick and sophisticated baffle systems. But the operating principle is identical to Dimitri's 1880 design. Burn once daily, small fire, stored heat, 24-hour warmth. The technology that was illegal in the 1880s is now recognized as the most sustainable way to heat with wood. Building codes have slowly adapted. Modern codes in some jurisdictions now explicitly allow masonry heaters despite their unconventional smoke routing. The key requirement is that the system must be properly engineered and built by qualified masons. The illegal aspect has been replaced by specialist construction requiring expertise. The technology is legal but regulated, acknowledged as different from conventional fireplaces, and requiring different standards. The story of Dimitri's illegal trick that makes a tiny fire heat an entire cabin offers several enduring lessons. First, conventional rules often codify mediocrity rather than excellence. The rules about straight chimneys and direct venting ensured that fireplaces worked adequately, but prevented them from working optimally. Violating those rules allowed superior performance. Second, efficiency comes from capturing waste. Conventional fireplaces wasted 80% of fuel energy up the chimney. Dimitri's heater captured that waste in thermal mass. The difference between waste and efficiency was a matter of design, not technology. Third, thermal storage enables discontinuous heating. You don't need a fire burning constantly if you can store energy and release it gradually. The battery principle applies to heat as well as electricity. Charge the battery periodically. Draw from it continuously. Fourth, small intense fires are superior to large prolonged fires. Small fires burn hotter, achieving complete combustion. Large fires burn cooler, producing more smoke and creosote. Counterintuitively, burning less wood more intensely produces more usable heat than burning more wood at lower temperatures. Fifth, complexity in construction can enable simplicity in operation. The masonry heater was complex to build, requiring skill and time. But once built, operation was simple. One fire per day, minimal tending, consistent results. The upfront investment in complexity paid ongoing dividends in simplicity. Finally, physics beats convention. The rules said smoke must go up. Physics said smoke would flow wherever pressure differentials directed it. When physics and convention conflict, physics wins. Understanding the physical principles allowed Dimitri to design beyond conventional limitations. The tiny fire that heated an entire cabin was possible because most of the fire's energy was captured rather than wasted. The illegal design that violated every rule worked better than any legal alternative. The trick that experts would condemn turned out to be the most advanced heating technology available. Samuel Bridger, who initially called the design illegal and dangerous, lived until 1918. In his later years, he told anyone who would listen about the Russian heater that had revolutionized his winters. He'd built 3 different masonry heaters over his lifetime, each one an improvement on the previous design. His final heater, built in 1910, was large enough that he only needed to fire it every other day in moderate weather. That heater was still standing and functional when his grandson sold the property in 1952. Hans Müller, who'd innovated the heated bench design, became a specialist builder of masonry heaters. Between 1885 and 1900, he built over 30 heaters for various mountain cabins and small settlements. He charged for his labor and expertise, turning knowledge gained from Dimitri into a modest income source. Muller's heaters were known for their reliability and efficiency. Several of his constructions remained in use into the 1940s. The knowledge of masonry heater construction passed through several generations in the Bitterroot region. Children who grew up in cabins with masonry heaters learned the operating principles. Some went on to build their own heaters when they established their own homes. Others became builders, constructing heaters professionally. The technique, once considered illegal and dangerous, became a recognized specialty craft. By the mid-20th century, most of the original frontier masonry heaters had been replaced or abandoned as modern heating systems became available. Oil furnaces, electric heat, and propane heaters offered convenience that wood burning couldn't match. The labor of even minimal wood cutting became unacceptable to people accustomed to thermostat-controlled comfort. But some heaters survived. A cabin near Darby, Montana, built in 1893 with a masonry heater based on Dimitri's design, remained occupied until 1976. The heater worked perfectly for 83 years, requiring only minor maintenance and occasional repointing of the mortar. When the cabin was finally abandoned, the heater was documented by a historical society, and some of its stones were salvaged for display in a local museum. Modern masonry heater builders have studied historical examples like Dimitri's to understand traditional techniques. The principles that made his heater work, thermal mass sizing, passage design, combustion air management, are now understood scientifically. Contemporary builders can calculate optimal dimensions rather than relying on experimentation. But the calculations confirm what Dimitri understood intuitively. Massive stone structures with winding smoke passages are the most efficient way to burn wood for heat. The environmental benefits of masonry heaters have gained renewed importance in the 21st century. Climate concerns make wood burning controversial due to emissions. But masonry heaters, with their hot, clean burns and minimal fuel consumption, produce far less pollution than conventional wood stoves or fireplaces. A properly operated masonry heater can be essentially carbon neutral, burning sustainably harvested wood with such efficiency that environmental impact is minimal. The technique that was once illegal because it violated conventional wisdom is now valued because it produces results that align with modern environmental and efficiency goals. The circle has completed. What was forbidden became standard, what was standard became obsolete, and what was forbidden is now advanced. The legacy of Dimitri's illegal trick lives on in every modern masonry heater, every thermal mass heating system, every design that prioritizes capturing heat over venting it quickly. The understanding that rules can be wrong when they conflict with physics. The recognition that small fires burned properly beat large fires burned wastefully. The knowledge that efficiency comes from working with thermal principles rather than against them. The tiny fire that heated an entire cabin wasn't magic. It was physics, thermal mass, heat transfer, storage, and release. Principles that Dimitri understood from his Russian childhood and adapted to Montana materials. Principles that every heating expert said were illegal, but that proved to be superior to every legal alternative. The illegal trick that made it work was simply refusing to follow rules that were based on tradition rather than physics. Building passages that went down when convention said smoke only goes up. Creating resistance when convention said chimneys need maximum draft. Burning small fires once daily when convention said fires should burn large and constantly. Every violation of the rules produced an improvement in performance. Neighbors mocked it. Experts condemned it. Authorities would have prohibited it if they'd known about it. But it worked. It worked better than anything else. And in the end, working is all that matters. The illegal heater that shouldn't have functioned became the only heater that actually solved the problem of heating efficiently in extreme cold. Dimitri's petka proved that sometimes the best solution is the one everyone says is impossible. That violating the rules is acceptable when the rules are wrong. That illegal can be better than legal when legal is based on convention rather than understanding. And that a tiny fire can heat an entire cabin if you're willing to build a heating system that experts would never approve.